Thank you very much for having me. It's a delight being here. So in this paper, I would like to introduce some work I've been doing on an Australian Research Council-funded project with a team of archaeologists, heritage consultants, industry partners, including the Blue Mountains World Heritage Institute, the National Parks and Wildlife Service, and the local community in the mountains. Our research site is a small section of the UNESCO World Heritage Area of the Blue Mountains in New South Wales, 90 minutes drive west of Sydney in Australia. A behind-the-scenes partner to the project includes Scenic World, which has been open from 1945 and is reportedly Australia's most visited privately owned tourist attraction. Phil Hammond, the head of Hammond's Holdings, owns this tourist destination and is deeply invested in the engineering history of the site his grandfather built and his children run the company today. The family owns this attraction, consisting of a cable car crossing the valley and down into the valley floor, as well as the Sydney Harbour Bridge climb, which is also extremely popular and profitable. So this research project began 3 years ago, but has been heavily disrupted by COVID, floods and a tragic accident in the mountains that has delayed field work and surveying of the site because it is deemed unsafe due to the risk of rockfall. It will be extended for another year, so hopefully the archaeologists can match the work of the historians in the team who have been busy in the background working in the archive, mostly local, undertaking focus groups and oral history interviews. We are interested in exploring the historical memory of the site and how it might be memorialised today and into the future. As the first collaborative and multidisciplinary, scholarly and community-based study of a forgotten shale mining settlement in the environmentally and culturally significant Jameson and Megalong valleys, this project aims to advance knowledge and enable cross-generational engagement with the history and heritage of an industrial landscape, thereby improving our understanding of the long-term impact of deindustrialisation on localities and their social and natural environments. By combining archaeological, archival and oral evidence, the project aims to provide new insights into everyday working and family life, community, gender, transiency and migration that can contribute to conservation of this site and its industrial heritage, cultural heritage tourism and education at a time of immense environmental change. Promised outputs include a heritage assessment that will be used by the National Parks and Wildlife Service to protect and preserve the site and related objects, as well as a handful of academic journal articles, but most importantly, we are planning a historical walking tour that can be used in situ and not, and so it might be enjoyed in the comfort of people's own homes for those unable to travel to the mountains or to tackle the grueling trekking involved. It is a beautiful but inhospitable site and not for the faint-hearted tourist. So those of you who are familiar with my work in family history will not be surprised to learn that I am particularly interested in how family history and local history research can be used to challenge traditional historical narratives and national versions of the past in this area. So in this context, I'm using family and local history to challenge authorised heritage discourses produced in the Blue Mountains, revealing how Blue Mountains communities have memorialised their history since the late 19th century, what effective relationships have been forged in this process, and their political consequences. I have analysed the tangible and intangible culture associated with this abandoned mining settlement, drawing on interviews and surveys with family, local and community historians, and the material culture collections associated with local history held in private collections and the local history collections of Blue Mountains museums and libraries. Broadly speaking, an emphasis on tourism depoliticised the Blue Mountains in the late 19th century. And as a public historian, I am committed to inserting the politics back into this space by examining the memory work involved in representing the Blue Mountains from the late 19th century. The local community has largely erased its industrial past and the lives of those who once lived, loved and laboured there to concentrate on attracting tourists to the area to be spellbound by its natural beauty. The history of the poor, working class, transient community, including the women, children and Aboriginal communities in the mountains, have been largely hidden from local, popular and community memory and scholarly attention due to the competing interests of the mining and tourism industries. But our team of researchers wants to convince the tourist industry that it would be a good idea to engage with this lesser-known past. We hope that our proposed walking tour will represent the histories of historically marginalised groups in the mountains and transform people's engagement with the past, present and future site in innovative and educative ways. The scholarly literature has suggested that settler colonial nations have tended to focus on the natural environment rather than built colonial heritage when representing their national histories. Family history allows us to repoliticise the site, foregrounding class, gender and race in our analysis. And what agentic roles can locals, families, museums and libraries play in this process? While many Australian people accept the authorised heritage discourse that privileges national narratives of colonial settlement and white exploration without question or reflection on its impact on First Nations peoples or working class populations, research has shown that most Australian citizens often enjoy engaging with history on a personal level, enjoying an intimate connection to the past, learning about the social history of the marginalised. This leads some to use these intimate, more vernacular and emotionally present histories to challenge the authorised heritage discourse produced by nation states and wealthy elites. So this talk will reveal how some Blue Mountains locals have used family history and heritage as a tool of opposition and subversion since the mid-20th century. It also shows the potential of family and local history to challenge authorised heritage discourses more radically in the present and future, and the productive outcomes of passionate encounters with the past on a local and regional level. It takes its cue from a number of cultural heritage scholars and public history practitioners, including Dolores Hayden, who has played with the politically subversive possibilities of heritage in her work in urban communities in Los Angeles. And I want to encourage historians and heritage practitioners to work with regional communities to make people better aware of the historical and social construction of spaces and places, and the emotional and political uses and meanings attached to them. We hope to suggest future pathways to a more politically active engagement with history in the area. The Blue Mountains Cultural Centre in Katoomba certainly foregrounds the spectacular scenery of the mountains rather than its local history. The valorisation of white male settlers by the local tourist industry began in the late 19th century, when tourists were first attracted to the mountains, and this memory of settlement and discovery remains powerful today. Most locals without an explicit interest in history are not interested in the area's past at all. When settler history has been the focus of local history exhibitions, this has until recently been celebratory, male, explorer and pioneer, and focused on the first Blue Mountains crossing in 1813 and the Explorers Tree, which I don't have time to go into today. But briefly, I want to outline two case studies of local historic houses, Torella and Woodford, showing how local women worked hard to share their passion for the past using family and local history. These women conserved and celebrated history to challenge the historical invisibility of women and the regions through their work with local historical societies. Passionate advocates working for local museums and historical organisations are continuing their work and ensuring their memories and the political impact of that memory work is not lost to present and future generations. And I want to reveal the quiet political activism at play here and how others might learn from it. So the Blue Mountains Historical Society has encouraged diverse historical engagement with the mountain's past since its establishment in 1946. A historic house museum, Torella Cottage, sits adjacent to the Blue Mountains Historical Society's headquarters, library and archives. Open on the last Sunday of each month, it attracts about 30 to 40 visitors per month. Volunteers suggest that most visitors do not know the cottage's history, but are broadly interested in regional and local history. Displays within the cottage focus on the lives of its owners, including John McLaughlin, a Sydney solicitor and local politician who constructed the home as a holiday retreat for his family to escape Sydney's hot summers. The reason the cottage survives today is due to the efforts of its daughter Beryl, who studied science at the University of Sydney, graduating in 1910, and Beryl worked as a teacher before studying architecture, graduating in 1922 to earn her living. She never married, which some suggest was due to the death of a sweetheart and close friend of her brother Geoffrey. Having survived Gallipoli, Geoffrey perished as a result of the gas attack at Passchendaele. He was awarded the Military Cross, and Ross Ingram, current treasurer of the Blue Mountains Historical Society, told me while touring the cottage that contemporary members of the society suspect that both siblings might have been gay, their words. Their father suffered from heart disease, dying without leaving a will in February 1918, and his entire estate went to his eldest son, who was a dastardly family member. He was convicted of fraud and larceny and declared bankrupt several times. He took over his father's estate, sold all of the Sydney homes, and forced his mother and sisters out to the tiny weatherboard holiday cottage in the Blue Mountains, where they lived for the rest of their lives. They became active members of their local communities. Beryl and her elder sister became early patrons of the Blue Mountains Historical Society, and Beryl cemented her association with the organisation in 1955 when she offered up her rooms for the society as a meeting space. And in 1968, they established a museum from the society on the land. Beryl, unmarried and childless, bequeathed the cottage and its attached land to the society on her death. And as Ingram suggests, continued survival of her house means that Beryl, quote, will live on forever. It might be safe to assume that Beryl was well aware of the history she was making when passing on her stories and possessions to the society. Current Vice President of the Society, Robin Ridge, suggests the house has focused a little too much on the life story of Beryl's brother Geoffrey, the war hero, largely neglecting Beryl's legacy in the process. And it's only in the last 2 years or so that Beryl's life story has been emphasised and highlighted. In a detailed, excellent website recounting the history of the cottage and its residents, Beryl is placed at the bottom of a long list of McLaughlin family members, which is unfortunate considering that the sole reason the cottage survives today is due to her efforts and bequest. So museums around the world were transformed in the 1960s and 70s, and this was especially the case in metropolitan areas, but less so in rural and regional parts of Australia. Nonetheless, a renewed interest in Australian history and increased passion for the past among ordinary Australians allowed lots of smaller museums to flourish as people working outside the structures of the state became enthused by projects of memorialisation. New museology sometimes confronted traditional curatorial emphasis, monumentality, national trust versions of the past, and the regulatory functions of the museum set up in the service of a nation-state. Local museums came to thrive as sites of community meaning-making that were and are often managed by independent volunteers on shoestring budgets. Museums across New South Wales rely on enthusiastic and supportive local volunteers and benefactors to survive and thrive. And regional museums thrive best when managed in partnership with community members. Laura Jane Smith has suggested that museums and sites memorialising the global industrial past are more likely to appeal to working-class visitors and those with an emotional and political investment in these sites. Family histories are often significant in the production and consumption of these sites, and visitors' readings and experiences of engagement with heritage and history can be transformative. This means that the political work of local and regional museum management of cultural heritage has the potential to be much more radical than that of naturally conservative national museums. After engaging with local museums across the Blue Mountains, I want to suggest that there is much potential to build on the radical, innovative, creative work in the Blue Mountains museum sector. Most of my survey respondents and focus group participants want more people, locals and tourists to know about the valuable labour and legacies of local women. Despite their passion, efforts and enthusiasm, however, much of this history remains invisible to most. These Blue Mountains women are key to this process of meaning-making, revealing the value of their often invisible labour within their families and communities. Their work as powerhouses of their local communities is revealed in the transfer of their private stories and belongings to public spaces and display that are then disseminated by locals who share similar passions for the past. So another historic property, the earliest built house in the mountains, situated on the main road through the mountains and well known to most locals but barely known to others. I've driven past it hundreds of times and I only came across it recently. This site, Woodford Academy, has been a school, pub, guest house and private residence since it was established in 1832, and it holds a variety of objects dating from the 1890s. The property was bequeathed to National Trust in 1979 by John McManaman's sole surviving daughter, Gertrude. And I don't have time to tell you her life story, but here is another educated, unmarried woman committed to using history and heritage to reveal the hidden labour of women in the local community. So Woodford Academy had been close to closure due to low visitor numbers, but user engagement and visitation to the site has increased dramatically in recent years. Shifts in display and curation have focused on integrating the community with considerable success. The property also houses an excellent cafe with lots of delicious cakes and has incorporated a local member of the Aboriginal group within the area to also talk about the site's engagement with local Aboriginal people as well. The collaboration between the National Trust, its hard-working volunteers and local artists, it's brought a lot of creatives into the site as well, has been very productive. So local museums and libraries remain important sites of civic purpose in the mountains and elsewhere. They are the beating hearts of their communities. But many people within the area remain concerned by the same dreary stories being repeated by local tourist businesses and the council in the area. The council and related history organisations might be better served by highlighting more diverse histories of the area's past. Local and community historians find the process of the historical resurrection of ordinary people and local history empowering both for their ancestors and themselves. And histories produced within families and later valued by local museums have the potential to become part of the rich multicultural history of their nations. And the memory making undertaken by family and local historians allows these researchers to use their personal histories to insert themselves and their family into wider historical narratives from which they have been excluded up to now. So the Blue Mountains Historical Society and the local National Trust volunteers are doing excellent work, but they need support. And if they work collaboratively, and they don't at the moment, the history of women in the mountains might come through more coherently. While they are all keen to better represent the history of women and Aboriginal people in the area, the history of the area's working class remains undocumented and not represented. Both Beryl and Gertrude were relatively affluent women compared with the miners' wives and related service workers our research project is mostly focused on. So our team of researchers aim to integrate the history of the working class as a group, including working class women and children and Aboriginal people, and to share the history we produce in this walking tour. But this is a fraught process, particularly because the two Aboriginal groups based in the mountains for many thousands of years, the Darug and Gundungurra people, remain conflicted about land ownership, boundaries, and other issues. This complicates community consultation, and the team continue to work with the Blue Mountains World Heritage Institute and the local council to progress its work. But I've been trying for 3 years now with no luck so far. We hope that the National Parks and Wildlife Service will help us make progress in the coming weeks, and I can only report back on this. So most of the research team, driven by their work in public history, are motivated by their politics and intent on examining and foregrounding class, race and gender in history. But while I find this relatively easy with regards to class and gender, it is much harder grappling with how best to represent and engage with Aboriginal communities. And this remains a fraught process within my institution and nationally across Australia as well. I wish I had more time to introduce some of my thinking about the politics involved in the construction of walking tours, including the limited cultural scripts of many walking tours, the focus on rags to riches, on gentrification, monumentality and built heritage, the difficulties of integrating intangible cultural heritage, which is often not undertaken in consultation with locals and community members, but I don't have time. Museums, heritage sites, and locally produced creative and historical engagements with the past need to matter to local communities, to represent their diversity and to help build healthy, inclusive communities. The Blue Mountains community knows very little about the area's industrial past. Even people who visit Scenic World, one of Australia's most popular tourist destinations, remain blissfully unaware of the area's mining history, despite it being marked and represented on the valley floor. The forgotten labour history of the mountains, the history of women, children and Aboriginal people that they lived amongst and depended upon, has much potential for drawing thousands more visitors to the mountains to stay, shop and spend, which would have enormous economic, cultural and social benefits for the area, as well as, we hope, productive political outcomes. Thank you.
Thank you very much.